true is the caveman stereotype? Where and how did our early ancestors live? If we look to our closest living relatives, gorillas and chimpanzees, gorillas tend to live in kin groups of perhaps a dozen individuals, while chimpanzees form in groups of as many as 100 or more. Gorilla territories might encompass about 15 square kilometers, while chimpanzees tend to average closer to 40 square kilometers. Chimpanzee home range sizes are especially flexible and depend on such factors as how many group members there are and what the surrounding landscape is like, as well as who lives nearby. Most chimpanzee foraging takes place in a core area, surrounded by a periphery, and males are extremely territorial. Violent conflict can occur near the borders of these territories. Each night, chimpanzees painstakingly build new nests from freshly gathered leaves and twigs to sleep in. Chimps use a variety of plant species to construct their nests, some of which have medicinal properties. So, perhaps not coincidentally, these nests contain significantly less bacteria than does the bed of an average person. It appears our ancestors prepared for sleep in a somewhat similar fashion. At Border Cave in South Africa, evidence of bedding has been recovered in archaeological layers dating as far back as 227,000 to 183,000 years ago. These beds consisted of blades of grass and camphor leaves, which have insecticidal properties. Many DEET-free and natural bug sprays on the market today include camphor as an ingredient. What's more, the beds appear to have been constructed on top of and mixed with ash, remnant layers of previous bedding, which probably doubled as another protective element from insects and provided some insulation. The early bedding was identified through a number of sophisticated methods, including soil micromorphology, which I'll discuss in a moment, and a technique called phytolith analysis. Phytoliths are tiny, microscopic, silica-based particles left behind by the decay of plants. Think of them as the fossils of individual plant cells. While a plant is living, silica helps provide rigidity within the structure of the plant as it's absorbed. The silica forms different shapes depending on whether it's located in the leaf or the stem. An expert can generally identify a phytolith as coming from a blade of grass versus the leaf of a tree, although this isn't true for all plants. What's more, phytoliths can tell us whether plant material was burned or not, based on whether the fossilized cells appear clear or dark under the microscope. A team led by South African archaeologist Lynn Wadley found that bedmaking also occurred around 77,000 years ago at Sibudu Cave in South Africa. Wadley's team is the same one that discovered the bedding at Border Cave. The beds at Sibudu included remnants of sedges, rushes, grasses, and camphor bush. Wadley's team used phytolith and micromorphology analysis, paired with an experiment in which they constructed beds out of dried sedges, burned and compressed the beds, and then repeated the process before burying their creation. Later, they excavated and analyzed the remains to compare with the original archaeological material. They found that the phytolith remains and resulting soil micromorphology were similar to that found in the archaeological sample. So what does micromorphology entail? It's another technique in our archaeological toolkit, and, as its name suggests, another method that involves staring down the eyepiece of a microscope. Geoarchaeologists concentrate on the geological aspects of archaeology. One of the more specialized approaches is micromorphological analysis. It begins in a relatively unsophisticated way. Stratigraphic sections, that is, the exposed vertical surface of an excavation trench that shows the layers of sediment as they were originally deposited, are sampled by removing rectangular blocks that preserve the integrity of the layers. Normally, you'd target an area that is visibly of interest, such as the corner of an ancient house floor or ash from a fire. Once the block has been removed, it's taken to a lab, where it's impregnated with resin and left to cure for some time as the resin dries. Then, several slabs are cut into thin sections, which are polished and mounted for microscopy. I learned this technique as a master's student at Cambridge and found it fascinating. Under the microscope, you can see fine layers of site formation not visible to the naked eye. And the arrangement of particles can tell you about things like trampling and redeposition. In the case of the beds at Cebudu and Border Caves, that's exactly what researchers saw. Evidence of routine burning, the ash trampled down, and fresh beds made. Lithics were also recovered in the bed areas, leading archaeologists to suggest that they were likely seeding areas for other activities too, like the manufacture of stone tools in the cave. Can you imagine living in a cave? Most caves are uninvitingly dark, dank, and quite frankly, if something else already lives there, dangerous. So why do we find so much evidence of human activity in caves? For the most part, people in the past were never really cavemen, dwelling inside a cave and using it as we think of a home today. Most archaeological evidence of human activity in and around caves is at their entrance, or mouth. Caves consist of three main parts: the entrance, a twilight zone, and a dark zone. Sometimes we find cave art and human remains in the twilight zones, and even the dark zones, but it's likely that these areas were off limits for regular use, and they might have even had sacred connotations. As groups used the entrance area of a cave, activities were probably also taking place outside. These might not be as well preserved as contexts inside the cave. We see this bias in the overall archaeological record. It's far more likely that the shelter caves provided to people also protected what was left behind. In contrast, open-air sites, exposed to the elements, might not have left traces of human activity. This creates a bias in the archaeological record towards cave sites, even though people were spending plenty of time in the daylight. Without doubt, humans made camp in a variety of environments, including out in the open. We do have evidence, although it's scarce, of lithic scatters, hearths, and bone remains from throughout the Paleolithic period. But among the first rules of survival is to construct shelter. So where is the evidence for that? Most camps were probably ephemeral, occupied for short periods of time, and constructed of organic materials like wood that did not preserve. The distribution of natural resources played a role in where people chose to live and when and how far to move. Whether a cave or structure, these hearths and homes represent safety, security, and permanence in the landscape for the first time, and served as a crucial hub for food preparation and toolmaking. So what then is our earliest evidence for built structures? This too comes mostly from caves. At the cave site of Halfataia in Libya, a post hole in a layer dating to between 30,000 to 40,000 years ago attests to deliberate construction. Post holes are distinctive archaeological features. They occur from a hole being dug, a cut, to place a piece of wood, the post, into the ground. The earth is then stabilized with fill back around the wood. The wood eventually leaves a ring of ash if burned, or organic material if left to rot. So far, the very earliest evidence for post holes dates to 100,000 years ago. 3 post holes were found at the Zambian site of Mammoth Cave. Their location seemed to have been for a wall, interpreted as a windbreak, protecting a semicircular deposition of bone, lithics, and ash. Some argue that the lack of evidence for structures at open-air sites, where archaeological evidence does exist for lithics, bones, and fire, means that people didn't bother to build any shelter at all. But horse herders in the Mongolian steppe, for example, set up yurts that didn't require post holes or digging. And after returning to such a site a year later, you might not see any evidence that people had been there at all. Indeed, ethnoarchaeology might help bridge the gap between what we expect to find at an ephemeral camp and what we do actually find. One of my favorite papers on this subject is by the Greek archaeologist Nina Galanidou, who reviewed the use of space by modern foragers at caves and rock shelters in different environments. Galanidou found that people use space in different ways, with separate activity areas, refuse disposal areas, and hearths, but that these patterns are related more to the cultural background of a group and the way that people relate to the space than to any physical constraints of the space. This idea is essential to keep in mind when we interpret how ancient peoples perceived their surroundings and their need for shelter and fire. It may be that the occurrence of fire and the existence of hearths are better proxies for identifying human occupation. The earliest documented occurrence of human-controlled fire is hotly debated, but could have been as early as 1.5 million years ago. It's important to separate opportunistic use of fire from the routine of making it. We might find evidence of fire use through burning, but archaeological hearths are the product of fires that were started, controlled, and burned at certain temperatures and occurred in the same spot more than once. Some of the earliest evidence for the use of fire is from Africa, when Homo erectus roamed the land. But it is inconclusive as to the extent that it was routinely used, and whether or not humans created it, as opposed to taking advantage of existing fires, such as those caused by lightning strikes. Some of the best evidence for human-controlled fire comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, reaching back 1 million years ago. Contemporary analysis applying micromorphology and a technique called FTIR shows that plant material and animal bones were once burned there. Outside of Africa, the Gesher Beno Yaakov site in Israel yields related evidence from as early as 790,000 years ago that flint tools were burnt in order to harden them. Not until about 400,000 years ago does the evidence seem to support routine control over and use of fire, represented by examples of burnt material and ash layers. Some of the best early evidence for the repeated and deliberate use of hearths in Europe comes from the Bolomor cave site in Spain. 14 hearths, each made in a rough circular shape on the ground, were analyzed macro and microscopically and found to date back 228,000 years, with an error range of about 50,000 years. This might sound like a lot, but it's important to keep in mind that the further back in time we go, the less precise our dating methods are. In this instance, researchers dated snail shells in the archaeological layer containing the hearths. They used a method called amino acid racemization, which has been growing in popularity, yet still remains somewhat controversial. Amino acid racemization works like this. Our DNA tells our bodies which amino acids to produce. These combine to form proteins. The molecular structure of amino acids can exist in one of two possible forms, L and D, which are mirror images of one another. In living organisms, amino acids exist, for the most part, in their L form. As in other dating methods, an event occurs to start the clock ticking. In radiocarbon and amino acid dating, it's the death of the individual. Once an individual dies, the amino acids in the body begin to shift from L to D, but not all at the same time. We measure the ratio of L to D forms to estimate how long it's been since death. One problem is that, unlike radiocarbon, which decays at a constant rate no matter what, the decay rate here can be influenced by a number of external and internal factors, including the acidity of the surrounding sediment, humidity, and temperature. Basically, any variable that affects the overall preservation of the material. In our example, the snails in the layer with fire might have been dead for quite a while before the layer was buried, but not more than 50,000 years, which encompasses the range of error for this date. Still, amino acid racemization is useful only in certain circumstances, and the problem of calculating the decay rate is a big one. It's something I expect to be refined in the future, as the technique is applied more widely. So, if evidence for hearths and homes is relatively scarce throughout most of human history, when do we start to see it flourish? It's not until later in the Upper Paleolithic period, around 15,000 years ago, when evidence for more significant built structures appears, though nothing yet that we might refer to as a village. The Mezyryk site in Ukraine is notable because it yielded one of our best examples of early musical instruments, a mammoth skull painted with ochre and other bones apparently used to beat it like a drum. But the site is also remarkable because of another way these mammoth bones were used, to build houses. In 1965, a local farmer discovered the lower portion of a mammoth jaw, a mandible, and reported his find. Subsequent excavation revealed 4 large circular dwellings, the largest measuring 8 meters, or around 26 feet in diameter. It was entirely constructed from mammoth bones. In at least one of the structures, mandibles were used to create the foundational first layer, with flatter bones such as the scapula used higher up in the structure. It's likely there was perhaps a wooden frame, but wood was too scarce on the frozen landscape at the time to be used for the entire structure. Animal skins probably helped insulate the bone structure from the elements. At the time these houses were built, 15,000 years ago, the world was in the throes of the end of the last ice age. Though the peak had passed, conditions in Ukraine would have still been tundra-like at the time. This feat of early engineering is all the more impressive when you consider the weight of the bones. Each structure used about 20 tons of bone, and the remains of an estimated 95 mammoths. This is not the only archaeological site with evidence for mammoth bone houses, but it's also important for what it implies about the overall settlement pattern. Here, the world's earliest map was inscribed on a piece of ivory. It represents a schematic of the local area at the confluence of 2 tributaries of the Dnieper River. Other mammoth bone sites were also found along this river valley, situated on old terraces with strategic views overlooking what likely were fertile hunting grounds below. Yet another example of an early built settlement comes from the Mesolithic site of Lepenski Vir in Serbia, along the Iron Gates Gorge of the Danube River. Caves near the site bear evidence of use during the last ice age at least 20,000 years ago. But not until well after the world began to warm did Lepenski Vir coalesce, about 9,500 years ago. One reason this site is fascinating is for what it shows us about how modern scientific techniques can inform us of the past at amazing levels of detail. Sometimes, the story of history changes completely. Lepenski Vir was first discovered in 1960 and began to be excavated in 1965. So, radiocarbon dating existed, but it was rudimentary, and other, more refined methods of excavation were not yet de rigueur. Over a period of about 5 years, amazing finds emerged at the site, including enigmatic fish sculptures, stone-lined hearths, trapezoidal structures with hard lime plaster floors, which were interpreted as both houses and shrines, and a necropolis. It was thought that this site represented an early, advanced agricultural population. The zooarchaeologist Sandor Bocconi published a paper in the journal Science claiming that the site was an example of local animal domestication, occurring independently from what was happening in the Near East. Early radiocarbon dates seem to support the argument, but some questioned the accuracy of the claims. Unfortunately, what was excavated from the site was moved nearly wholesale and reconstructed at another location in 1970, when a hydroelectric dam flooded the Iron Gates, inundating Lepenski Vir and many other archaeological sites whose stories, as a result, will never be known. Still, advancements in radiocarbon dating technology, particularly the advent of accelerator mass spectrometry, which allows for more precise dates, enabled researchers to return to the question of the dates for Lepenski Vir in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Animal bones and human remains from the site were re-evaluated using improved radiocarbon methods. And the dates did not agree with each other. Humans appeared to have lived there earlier in time than some of the animals from the same layers. What would cause this discrepancy? Researchers carried out stable isotope analysis on the human and animal remains and found that these people, in addition to hunting and gathering, ate a lot of fish. And this had caused a big problem for the radiocarbon dating. Let me explain. As the Danube flowed across ancient limestone, old carbon-14 sequestered in the rock dissolved and entered the tissues of living fish alongside the carbon-14 atoms of the time. People ate these fish, ingesting old and new carbon. The stable isotope analysis revealed this, making it necessary to calibrate the freshwater reservoir effect by calculating the offset between fish-eating humans and non-fish-eating animals. Ultimately, they reached the conclusion that the site was a few thousand years more recent than originally argued, and not a unique instance of the early Neolithic period in Europe. The earliest layers at the site were reassigned to the Mesolithic period, prior to farming. Still, these Mesolithic layers contain intriguing evidence for lined hearths and the emergence of built structures prior to the arrival of domestic animals from further south. Early Holocene hunter-gatherer fishers were spending extended periods of time in one place and constructing more permanent places to sleep at night. Radiocarbon dating has been one of the best tools in archaeology for synthesizing the grand narrative of our shared past. And it's become quite the trend in archaeology to return to existing archaeological sites and redate them to refine our understanding. This helps us get at what was happening when at a particular site, and it helps us to comprehend change over greater temporal and spatial scales. For instance, one way archaeologists try to reconstruct the nature and extent of human settlement patterns through time is mapping and modeling with radiocarbon dates. Now, the radiocarbon date record is, for the most part, only as good as the excavated sites. So, blank spots on the map might represent not a lack of settlement, but instead a lack of research. Also, many radiocarbon dates generated before the advent of AMS instrumentation provided erroneously broad date ranges, artificially lengthening estimated periods of occupation. And some well-known sites don't have good radiocarbon dates, just lithic chronologies. Other problems arise when we consider material that was dated while people still thought that it was okay to smoke cigarettes during an excavation, introducing contamination from younger carbon. So, you might be able to amass 1,000 radiocarbon dates from a given region, but by the time you clean your data set, only 200 of them might be usable. To analyze a period of, let's say, 10,000 years, that's not very many data points. My colleague Mark van der Linden and I ran into some of these issues when we tried to evaluate the environmental and settlement history of the Balkans from the end of the last ice age through to the transition to the Neolithic period and the arrival of agriculture. We were able to argue that the overall population increased just prior to the introduction of domestic plants and animals, likely due to favorable environmental conditions at around 8,200 years ago. Others have applied radiocarbon date distribution modeling across Europe and North America to track the spread of populations and increases in population density. The drive to amass and synthesize radiocarbon dates and other types of archaeological evidence in an effort to model human settlement has led to the growth of numerous large, collaborative datasets in archaeology. In this way, we will continue to advance our understanding of the development of human society as we move forward in our study of the past.